Now, we're discussing age as an element that helps an individual identify himself or herself. Before age, there have been several other factors that we have taken into account. We had initially spoken about how your social class has an impact in terms of identifying you, how your gender has an impact in terms of helping you identify yourself. So was the case with ethnicity. Now, if we talk about a syllabus, along with social class, along with gender, along with ethnicity, age is the fourth element or the fourth factor that is considered to be important when it comes to an individual identifying himself or herself. Now, as we speak about age over here, I'm sure everyone would agree that broadly speaking, age could be put into five different categories. I mean, they could be more, they could be less. But yeah, broadly speaking, many sociologists, they take into account these five different factors when they are categorizing individuals according to different age brackets. So the first one over here is childhood. After childhood, we could speak about adolescence. After adolescence, the third in line over here is youth, adulthood. The fourth is middle age, and the fifth one is old age. So the five different factors that we're discussing over here are: number one, childhood, adolescence, youth, adulthood, middle age, and old age. Now, without any further ado, let's quickly move on and talk about Roberts et al. According to Roberts and others, age is a very important phenomenon. Age is a very important phenomenon or a very important aspect of an individual's identity. We're talking about the significance of age as an aspect of an individual's identity. Now, when we talk about differences on the basis of age, regardless of the social class you belong to, regardless of your gender, regardless of your ethnicity, regardless of your nationality, regardless of your religion, age is one aspect that affects everyone. In other words, what I'm trying to say over here is, regardless of you being rich or poor, regardless of you being male or female, regardless of the ethnic background you belong to, your age would always be seen as an important aspect that helps you identify yourself and that at the same time affects your life experiences. Now, with that clarity from Roberts et al., with that idea, with the emphasis on age as an element that helps us identify ourselves, let's move on towards Professor Bradley. Bradley in 1996. This is the lady that I'm talking about. Bradley in 1996 identified five major generational stages of age identities. Major Five major generational stages of age identity that exist in modern industrial societies. These ages are relative to particular society. Now, when we talk about these five different categories, as I talk about these five different categories, these categories are more or less accepted, acknowledged, and used as a category in many parts of the world. But at the same time, it is important as a sociology student that we understand and realize that these stages are relative to particular societies. There's a possibility that in one society, there's an acknowledgement or an acceptance shown to all five of these stages, whereas there is another society that does not believe in the distinction between maybe adolescence and youth adulthood. Now, as we've understood the idea that was put forward by Roberts et al., that age is one important aspect that we cannot choose to ignore. Number two, we had spoken about Professor Harriet Bradley, and Harriet Bradley over here identified five different stages that individuals usually are divided into when we talk about different age brackets. Now, if you've understood this so far, let me move on and give you an example over here of the Jewish culture. Now, if we talk about Jews, movement from one stage to another may be symbolized or celebrated by cultural markers such as rite of passage. Now, over here, we're trying to understand what the word rite of passage means. Now, when we talk about the word rite of passage, we usually use the word rite of passage to refer to an event or a ceremony that changes an individual's social status, that changes an individual's identity, that changes how the world sees that particular individual, right? So the word rite of passage over here in this particular context is referring to any event, any ceremony that is symbolical in many cases, that might be seen as a cultural marker, right? That might be symbolical, that might be seen as a cultural marker through which an individual could move from one stage or one age bracket or one age phase of an individual's life to another. Now, in the Jewish culture, the distinction between bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah. Now, bar mitzvah is the ceremony, the event that Jewish boys usually go through when they are entering adulthood. And for females or for a girl, the word we use over here is bat mitzvah. You guys can Google them, you guys can YouTube them. There are enormous there's enormous resource that is available that would help you understand this. Now, bear this thing in mind when you're talking about Jewish culture. You could be using this as an example of cross-cultural comparison too. Moving on, if we talk about these different phases that were categorized by Bradley, to begin with, the first category that we have over here is childhood. Childhood in this today's world, in this contemporary era, is seen as a special, innocent, and vulnerable time of an individual's life. A time, a phase when an individual is seen as a blank slate, and a phase where an individual is socialized according to the culture he or she belongs to, a phase where an individual is considered to be the most vulnerable, a phase where an individual is seen to be innocent, a phase that is usually considered to be very special. Now, in modern industrial societies, childhood is seen as a special, innocent, and vulnerable time during which the child's identity should be developed through interaction with parents. Now, this interaction, when we talk about interaction with parents over here, we're of course referring to primary socialization. As we speak about primary socialization, we are aware, as we speak about primary socialization, we're aware how through parental interaction, how through your family an individual learns the norms, the values, the customs, gets used to with the traditions, what's acceptable, what's not, what is it that the society expects of you. And this interaction, this socialization process usually shapes your life ahead. So, this is one of the reasons why childhood is seen as a special, innocent, and vulnerable time of an individual's life. Now, taking this a little further, if we talk about Wells in 2014 notes that many modern states also intervene in family life to manage in childhood identity. Now, the state or the government would not intervene, would not want to step into something that is not considered to be important. Now, the state or the government realizes, accepts, acknowledges that childhood is that phase of an individual's life that requires attention and perhaps intervention. Intervention, or in other words, when the state or the country or the government decides that they need to they need to keep a check, they need to keep an eye as to how the childhood experiences of an individual, of a young, innocent, special individual are like. The state in many parts of in many what do you call it developed countries, the state takes the state takes adequate measures to ensure that the childhood experiences an individual has are protected. Now, this protection that we're talking about could be protection from internal threats. This protection we're talking about could also be protection from external threats. Internal threats such as keeping a child safe from the abuse, from the neglect that they might experience at home. External threats, keeping them protected from external threats over here refers to vaccinations. Maybe I have polio written down over here. In many parts of the world, in many parts of the, let's just say, developing world, because polio is seen as a thing of a past in the more developed parts of the world, but in countries like ours, in country like Pakistan, we still unfortunately come across individuals who end up having polio. So the state takes the responsibility over here. The state takes enough measures to ensure that children are kept protected from not only internal threats, but at the same time, external threats too. Next point, the state in many cases takes the responsibility for the emotional, physical, spiritual, and intellectual development of the child. Now, in let's just talk about the more developed parts of the world, because this syllabus that we're studying is again developed by people in the West. Now, in many developed parts of the world, in many welfare countries, the state takes the responsibility of the emotional well being of a child. If a child does not feel safe at home, they know where to contact, they know who to contact, and they are aware in many cases that the state would ensure that they are kept protected. The state takes this as its own responsibility. So the emotional well-being of a child is catered to. The physical well-being of child, I mean, it could be linked to something as simple as developing or having parks in any locality or neighborhood. The spiritual well-being, the intellectual development of the child. Over here, the involvement that the state has in developing the national curriculums that are taught across board in many countries. So through those national curriculums, if not any other mean, the state has its own intervention in working towards the spiritual as well as intellectual development of the child. The next point, in an attempt to shape the child's identity, many states have forbidden certain types of behavior, whereby adults label those behaviors as deviant. Now, an act such as smoking tobacco, this is seen as a deviant behavior. This is seen as something that many societies do not accept or approve of. Now, something that is bad, something that the society does not approve of, even for adults, is considered a deviant over here. And of course, when you talk about children, when you talk about a younger individual, in many cases, acts of such nature are forbidden. Taking this ahead, many societies have introduced a legal age at which children can be officially regarded as having a criminal identity. Now, you ought to be at least 10 years to be referred to or to be seen as a criminal in UK. Now, of course, this varies from society to society. This varies in this is more so a feature, a trait, a feature from the more developed parts of the world. Now, we're talking about minimum age for an individual. We're talking about the minimum age for an individual to be regarded as a deviant, sorry, to be regarded as a criminal. The Allah Akbar, to be regarded as a criminal. Now, the next point here, an important influence of a child's identity is the fact that they spend most of their impressionable years in school. Now, the extent to which the education system could be playing its role, the extent to which the education system could be playing its role in terms of the development or the well-being or the welfare of a child is recognized by many countries, almost all. Now, as we speak about the UK, even in UK, because it's a developed country, there is compulsory education that has been introduced. This compulsory education that has been introduced, this ensures that every child, regardless of the social class, ethnicity, gender, is has the opportunity to get educated. So making education compulsory for all children, making education compulsory for all children, again, is a measure, is again an intervention by the state when it comes to managing childhood identities. We're talking about managing childhood identities. Now, I hope this has helped. Moving on to the next slide. However, these different features that we just developed, these that we just discussed, these different features, they might be witnessed more in the developed parts of the world and not otherwise. If we talk about cross-cultural comparison over here, we should be aware that not every culture provides the same or is able to provide the same experience to a child. In many cases, we're aware that the childhood experiences that an individual has are not as protected as they are in the developed parts of the world. Now, in many countries, there are child soldiers. In many countries, the less developed parts of the world, we see how children are involved into, I mean, they play a major role in the economic workforce. They are used as cheap labor. They work in hazardous conditions, which again helps us understand as a sociology student that the features, the characteristics, or the important points that we just discussed while discussing childhood identity, while discussing how the state has its intervention, does not apply to all. There are many parts of the world, many less developed parts of the world, where the childhood experiences might differ, where the childhood experiences might not be as protected as they are in the developed parts of the world. So if we talk about cross-cultural comparison over here, even to this date, as we speak, as the first quarter of the 21st century, as I say, is coming to an end, we see how girls do not get the same opportunity that male students or boys receive when it comes to receiving basic education. Number one. Number two, the childhood experiences, like I said, in less developed parts of the world compared to the childhood experiences in the more developed parts of the world are very different. Now, the example that I gave you of how children work for a very measly pay, how children work in hazardous conditions, how children are kept deprived of intellectual, spiritual, physical, emotional development that they possibly could have had they been a part of, or had they been living in a more developed country. Now there are countries like Uganda that recruit children soldiers as well. Now how imagine how dangerous could that be for children? I mean, you're using children for as soldiers, you're using children for violent acts. This again plays a very important role in us understanding how the childhood experiences differ based on the culture we belong to. Now, it is not only culture. If you go back in time, we are aware, or we should be aware, or we should not ignore the fact that the childhood experiences have changed with time as well. In other words, what I'm trying to explain over here is, even if you keep the society and the culture constant over here, even if you're talking about the Western or the European society, the childhood experiences that kids had back in the 18th century compared to the 19th, 20th, and now the 21st century, they are very different. Now, after childhood, we'd move on and discuss adolescence. Now, when you use the word adolescence, which is also referred to as the youth, is the period between an individual's puberty and the achievement of full adult status. That in many countries is 18 years, right? Now, when you talk about adolescence, we're talking about teenagers over here. There are many sociologists who believe that the idea of adolescence is a recent invention. They believe that this idea of adolescence was not there back in the past, and this is something that has recently, I mean, relatively recently, in the last 30-40 years, gained a lot of popularity. Now, there's evidence that before 1950s, this stage was not recognized as a separate social stage. In modern digital societies from 1950s onwards, youth subcultures started appearing on the basis of growing consumer market catering to teenage interests. Now we're talking about how the consumer market, how the consumer market played its role in developing different youth subcultures. Of course, when you're talking about consumer market over here, you're talking about how different products are produced, manufactured, and then sold to a particular age bracket that, of course, is supporting capitalism, that, of course, would support the rich getting richer, that would support the media, that would support different industries. The next point, youth subcultures were seen as a problem of morality. Now, a problem of morality over here, you need to understand what the word morality means, the distinction between right and wrong. Youth subcultures being seen as a problem of morality and threatening to the older generations. Now, the norms, the subcultural norms, the values that are followed, that are carried by young individuals, by adolescents, might not be seen in a very positive light by individuals from an older generation. There are many people who still believe that these that this youth, that individuals who come from this particular age bracket, the adolescents, they are they're rebels. They do not go in line with the mainstream accepted culture of any particular society. The next point, according to Young and Cohen, these groups were policed harshly by agents of social control. Now, if you study sociology ahead in your universities, and if you take more interest in this, you would realize how, according to these researches that were conducted by Young and Cohen in the 1970s, have shown how the law enforcement agencies, they dealt with individuals of this particular age bracket in a harsher manner. However, this view that is held by some sociologists might not be acceptable by all, by others. However, many global studies find that the values held by young people are similar to those of their parents. Now, of course, when you're studying sociology, for every point you have a support and you have sociologists arguing against it as well. So we have individuals who fall into the category of who rather believe in the idea that the identities, the values, the norms that individuals from this particular age bracket carry are not in line with the values that individuals from older generations carry. The next point, most young people are conformists and place high values on traditional goals such as getting a job, housing, or getting married. Now, if we talk about a comparison over here, we're talking about a comparison between this point and this point. They are contrasting arguments over here. So, on one end, you're talking about how the youth could be potentially dangerous and they're policed accordingly by the law enforcement agencies. And on the other hand, you are denying this idea and showing support towards the idea that there isn't much of a difference between the values that are held by individuals of this particular age bracket compared to others. Now, we've spoken about childhood, we've spoken about adolescence, and now while we've discussed, as we've discussed adolescence, if we move on and talk about cross-cultural comparison over here too, many industrial, pre-industrial, and less developed societies do not recognize adolescence as a separate life stage, right? So, like I said in the previous slide, when we were discussing the previous slide, when I had said adolescence is seen by many as a recent development, right? In line, or rather say, further developing that idea, adolescence is seen as a different, as a distinctive phase of an individual's lives, more so in the developed parts of the world. And this is something that might not be found in the pre-industrial and less developed societies. So again, we're talking about a comparison in terms of time, in terms of place, in terms of culture. The next point, now we're talking about cross-cultural dimensions here. As a child reaches puberty, they're made to go through certain rituals and rites of passage after which they're considered as an adult. Now, again, you could go Google this. There are so many African tribes. They have their own rites of passages. They have their own events. They have their own ceremonies that are used as a cultural marker, that help an individual move from one phase to another. The next point, girls are taught domestic roles to be prepared for marriage. This happens to be true in many rural parts of our very own country too. If you talk about South Asian societies, if you talk about South Asian countries like Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, you'd see in many rural parts of our country, girls are taught domestic roles to be prepared for marriage, while boys are trained for their roles as farmers or hunters. This again can be true for agricultural, or you could say agrarian societies. This happens to be more true in rural societies. Remember, we studying sociology. What might be very obvious and evident in one part of the world might not be that obvious and evident in another. An example over here, these examples play a very important role because they help you with letting the examiner know that you not only have you understood a particular concept, but you could also apply it Now, this example over here, that is AO2. AO2 is analysis, I'm sorry, AO2 is interpretation and application. So in Papua New Guinea, the Sepik tribe make their boys go through a rite of passage, which involves a skin cutting ritual, which leaves scars signifying manhood. Again, this is something that does work for this particular tribe in this particular society. But if you talk about something of this sort in the Western world, it might not not be something that's acceptable either, right? Taking this further, the third phase that we have over here is young adulthood, the period between leaving the parental home and middle age, which again is a thing that is more common in Western societies and not others. According to Valentine in 2013, there are different markers that we could bring in the discussion over here: public and private, both public, such as buying your own clothes, private, such as getting married. Cultural markers exist in modern cultures, which signify the start of an adult identity. Taking this ahead, if we move on, this stage involves independence from parents and taking responsibility. When you're being independent, when you are being responsible, this is seen as young adulthood. In many countries, this is after you hit 18 years, or for others, after you hit 21 years. Now, we've spoken about childhood, we've spoken about adolescence, we've spoken about young adulthood, and the next in line we have over here is middle age. As we speak about middle age over here, middle age status is given more importance than the young and the elderly both in capitalist societies. If we talk about capitalist societies, if we talk about the more developed societies, if we talk about Western societies, you see how middle age has a higher status as compared to both the young and the elderly. That's because this is the group that usually comprises of a very successful, I mean, this is seen by many as a very successful socioeconomic group. There are certain social indicators of middle age where your children leave home, where you have enough of time, where you do not have time, but you have enough of money to spend on leisure activities. There are some social indicators, and at the same time, there are some psychological indicators too. Now, do not get confused between these both. When you talk about psychological indicators, the example of midlife crisis explains it pretty much all. When an individual is seen to be seeking purpose in life, an individual sees that the goals that an individual had set have by and large been achieved, and when they're seeking meaning, when they're looking for more of purpose in life. So we're talking about, in this particular context, now we were talking about different categories that help us understand, that helps us recognize that there are different identities that an individual might be experiencing based on the age bracket they belong to. We initially spoke about childhood, we then moved on and spoke about adolescence, then we moved on and spoke about young adulthood, followed by middle age, and towards the end now we'll be discussing old age. As we speak about old age over here, in pre-industrial and tribal cultures, now understand, it is important that we understand that even just like any other age bracket or phase, even old age experiences might not be the same for every individual in every part of the world. The experiences that individual has of old age living in a tribal society where he or she might be seen as a tribal chief, merely because of the age bracket that he or she belongs to. And if you compare this with an old age individual from the Western society who is abandoned maybe by his or her children and left to live with individuals of the similar age bracket in old age homes. So understand this as a sociology student, that your old age experiences, just like your experiences just like the experiences you had when you were going through a particular age and phase of life might differ from society to society, might differ from different time from might differ from time to time. So pre-industrial and tribal cultures give great respect and status to the elderly on the basis of their wisdom and experience. Now, this might be something like this says for pre which might be true for pre-industrial and tribal cultures. But then if you talk about Western cultures, this idea might not be as applicable. So you could always use this as a comparison. Now, many societies are religiously more inclined on emphasizing on the status of elderly. Talk about Christianity, talk about Islam, talk about Hinduism. Moving on, many elderly people in modern industrial societies have a negative self identity or self esteem. This is true more so in the developed parts of the world. After we're talking about this, after retirement phenomena, when you have retired, you are no more economically economically contributing towards the family maybe, or towards the society, towards a particular country too, which is again a reason, a factor which leads to holding a negative self identity, having a low self esteem, right? Now, these societies value the youth but do respect the knowledge and experience of the elderly. Now, we have another example over here of Vauclair. Negative self identity in the elderly is due to ageism. We need to understand what the word ageism over here means. When we use the word ageism, ageism refers to the prejudice or discrimination an individual, be it a male or female, black or white, rich or poor, experiences merely on the basis of the age bracket they belong to. When you are discriminated against because of the age bracket you belong to. So negative self-identity in the elderly is due to ageism, which stereotypes elderly as vulnerable, financial and social burdens, dependent and inferior. The elderly are likely to feel marginalized, isolated, and lonely. The elderly are also subject to infantilization. Now, when we use the word infantilization, like you see infants as being highly dependent on you, in many societies, the elderly people are treated in a manner that they are infantilized, whereby they're assumed helpless and dependent on others. They're assumed helpless and dependent on others. They're not regarded as independent adults with free will who can make their own choices. So we've spoken about how in many parts of the Western world, elderly individuals feel marginalized. What does the word marginalized over here mean? Marginalized or the powerless groups within a society. When you push this particular social group to a corner, that they start feeling very powerless, that they feel isolated, that they feel lonely, that they feel infantilized. Again, if we take this a little further and we speak about evaluating the ideas of old age. Again, if you're evaluating the ideas of old age, you can sprinkle a bit of postmodernist perspective or theory over here. As we speak about the postmodernist perspective, we remember, according to the postmodernist perspective, an individual has a lot of choice. An individual has a lot of choice. And because of this enormous amount of choice an individual has, it is on your discretion to feel old at the age of 70 or feel young at the age of 70. And bear this thing in mind, age is just one element, and there are many other elements too that eventually intersect to shape your overall experiences. In other words, what I'm trying to explain over here is, if you are old, your experiences of being old and being rich would be different from your experiences of being young. I'm sorry, your experiences of being old and rich might be different from your experiences of being old and poor. So, age over here intersects. We're talking about intersection over here of age on the basis of the social class you belong to. So, compare the experiences of a rich and a poor elderly individual on the basis of your gender, you being a male or female, on the basis of your ethnic origin. The next point, Life expectancy for affluent whites, affluent means wealthy over here. The life expectancy, the average amount of years you live, life expectancy of affluent whites in Western societies is increasing. Now, this could be because of medical facilities, this could be because of health related support that the more developed countries are able to provide to the elderly people. So, life expectancy for affluent whites in Western societies is increasing, and so age identities are becoming more flexible. So, if an individual is living longer, if an individual is living longer as compared to the past, this might lead to a lot of flexibility in terms of your old age identity, in terms of how you would want yourself to be seen, belonging to a particular age group or belonging to a particular age bracket. Now, for instance, when we use the word, I'm trying to explain you this word flexibility here. What or in what context are we using this word flexibility? So you must have come across old elderly people who are more physically fit as compared to young people too, who are more into sports, who are more socially active as compared to the young as well. And now this is when you're making comparison between individuals of the same age bracket, between individuals from different age brackets. However, if you talk about flexibility over here in terms of you belonging to the same age bracket, yet your experiences differing from each other, this is again true. There's more flexibility. You could choose to feel old and sick and someone who's close to dying, or you could choose to feel that you're young, that you're more physically capable, and etc., etc., and a lesser significant influence on self identity. According to Featherstone and Hepworth, they argue that global media messages are becoming less derogatory and condescending towards elderly people because this particular age bracket is seen by many as being very wealthy, being very influential politically, in many cases, religiously, etc., etc. So, with the passage of time, the global media messages, the media is becoming less harsh towards these elderly people too. Many celebrities have become elderly, however, through their wealth and status, though their wealth and status means that they can project a relatively youthful image and dignified image of old age to the world. Now, we are talking about the differences or the different experiences of the elderly people. This question that we have over here, evaluate the view that age is the most important influence on a person's identity. These could be, see them as indicative points because you do not necessarily have to write the same points. You could write any other point or any other reference or any other sociological material too. These 4 points in support and the 4 points against, where you have a way you could possibly write down how about how age might not be the most important influence on a person's identity. Over here, you could write down about Pierre Bourdieu's claim about how social class plays a very important role, Connell's claim about how gender plays a very important role, Jacobson's claim about how your ethnic identity plays a very important role, and towards the end, you could write down about postmodernist perspective, the postmodernist view that individuals today have a lot more choice to construct their identities, live their own life, have a particular lifestyle, and according to their personal preferences.